Have you ever wondered why so many empathic people spend their youth completely drained, constantly taken advantage of, and drowning in the stress of trying to fix everyone else's problems? In your 20s and 30s, being an empath can feel less like a gift and much more like a lifelong sentence to emotional exhaustion. You walk into a room and instantly absorb the tension, the unspoken anger, and the hidden sadness of everyone around you. You try so hard to build deep, meaningful connections, but you constantly end up struggling to hold relationships together with people who only know how to take while you give until you have absolutely nothing left. It is a painful, repeating cycle of pouring your heart into empty containers, overanalyzing every text message, and worrying about whether you said or did the wrong thing. Yet, if you look at these same empathic individuals as they grow older, something incredible happens. They slowly transform into the exact kind of people others can no longer easily manipulate, guilt trip, or stress out. They do not become bitter, and they do not build heavy, frozen walls around their hearts to keep the world out. Instead, they develop a depth of inner stability that functions like a deep, calm ocean. People can throw rocks at the surface, and storms can howl above them, but the depths remain entirely undisturbed. What truly happens inside them through all those painful years of trial and error is a complete psychological restructuring. They stop being reactive targets for other people's emotional chaos and start operating from a place of unshakable self-possession. The legendary psychologist Carl Jung believed that individuals who are forced by their very nature to live too deeply within their emotions, their pain, and their intense inner world are actually on a rare psychological path. They are navigating a heavy, transformative journey that very few people are strong enough to actually complete. Most people live safely on the shallow surface of life, avoiding their deepest wounds and masking their insecurities with superficial distractions. But an empath cannot do that. They feel everything at a volume of 10. Because they are forced to confront the darkest, heaviest parts of human emotion from an early age, the ones who make it through to the other side do not remain the same. They emerge fundamentally altered. They begin to see human behavior with absolute clarity. They stop lying to themselves about their own patterns, and most importantly, they are no longer controlled by the very traumas and manipulations that used to break them in half. The most profound truth you must understand about this evolution is that the ultimate power of an empathic person never actually came from how deeply or intensely they can feel. Their true power comes from everything they were forced to endure, survive, and dismantle within themselves just to stand firmly in their own identity. Every betrayal, every moment of being taken for granted, and every night spent crying in absolute exhaustion was secretly acting as a forge. It was burning away their naive illusions and forcing them to build a real psychological backbone. Age does not weaken a true empath. It strips away their vulnerabilities and refines their raw sensitivity into a quiet, lethal strength. By looking closely at how this happens, we can uncover the exact transformations that change an empath from an emotionally fragile target into an absolute force of nature. The absolute first reason empaths become completely unbreakable with age is remarkably simple. They completely stop trying to please everyone around them. There is a bizarre, quiet shift that happens to empathic people as they cross into the second half of life. They become incredibly difficult to wound, not because they have grown mean, cold, or uncaring, but because they finally realize that universal approval is a trap designed to keep them small. This creates a brilliant psychological paradox. The moment an empath stops living for everyone else's validation, they instantly develop a heavy, grounded presence that quietly unsettles the manipulative people around them. Controllers and narcissists thrive on an empath's desire to make things right. So when that desire vanishes, the manipulator completely loses their leverage. Think back to how many empaths lived during their youth. They exist exactly like water, constantly and automatically changing their shape to fit into whatever container other people force them into. If they are around an angry, volatile person, they immediately become softer, quieter, and hypervigilant just to absorb the impact and lower the tension. If they are dealing with an emotionally unstable partner, they force themselves to be endlessly patient, sacrificing their own sanity to act as an emotional anchor. In chaotic, high-pressure environments, they learn to suppress their own voice and stay silent so nobody else feels uncomfortable. And they mistakenly call this self-sacrificing behavior maturity. But if you strip away the excuses, it isn't maturity at all. It is a trauma response. It is a systematic shrinking of their own soul, just to be kept around, accepted, and loved by people who aren't even treating them well. This performance is exactly what Carl Jung referred to as the persona. It is the elaborate social mask that human beings unconsciously construct to survive safely and avoid rejection within the collective world. For the average person, the persona might look like an armor of wealth, power, or intellectual perfection. But for an empath, the mask almost always takes a completely different shape. It takes the form of the overly pleasant person, the hyper-understanding friend, the one who always anticipates everyone else's needs, and the one who is constantly twisting their own identity into whatever version makes everyone else feel the most comfortable. The devastating problem with wearing this specific mask for too long is that you entirely stop living according to your actual, authentic emotions. Instead, you start living exclusively according to how other people react to you. If someone gives you a compliment or seems pleased with your performance, you feel temporarily valuable and safe. But if someone is slightly disappointed, cold, or distant, you immediately enter a tailspin of anxiety and start questioning your entire self-worth. If a relationship begins to crack or show signs of tension, the young empath is almost always the very first person to frantically examine their own faults, wondering what they did wrong and how they can fix it. Slowly, they develop an incredibly dangerous way of moving through the world, continuously measuring their personal value through the emotional satisfaction of people who might not even care about them. In modern psychology, this is known as the fawning response, a deeply ingrained survival mechanism born from spending years navigating unpredictable, emotionally unstable, or hypercritical environments where peace had to be bought through total submission. But then the slow passage of time begins to change absolutely everything. This transformation does not happen because of one single dramatic explosion. It happens through the steady accumulation of hundreds of small, quiet heartbreaks repeated across decades. It happens every time they kept the peace at their own expense and were still completely misunderstood. It happens every single time they forced themselves to be the easiest, most accommodating person to love, only to be abandoned the moment they finally set a boundary. It happens every time they swallowed their true feelings to preserve a fragile relationship, only to look up years later and realize the other person never truly saw, appreciated, or cared about the real human being beneath the performance. Eventually, the mature empath arrives at a deeply painful but liberating realization. Some people and some relationships will only survive if you continuously distort, bend, and break yourself to fit their impossible expectations. The moment you stand up straight, they leave. And that realization is the precise turning point that makes them unbreakable with age. Because once a person genuinely no longer desperately needs external approval to feel okay inside, They become absolutely impossible to control. The emotional manipulation tactics that used to work on them effortlessly start losing every ounce of their power. Sudden silence from a partner no longer sends them into a panic frenzy of text messages. Other people's toxic disappointment no longer automatically converts into a heavy weight of guilt inside their chest. They finally understand a core psychological truth. Just because someone is unhappy with you does not automatically mean you did something wrong. This massive shift often terrifies the people around them because the world had become completely accustomed to the old version of the empath, the version that was always soft-hearted, always the first to apologize, and always willing to destroy their own peace to repair an emotional fracture. When the empath stops doing that, they create a chilling realization in others. This is a person who can no longer be bought, controlled, or manipulated through the threat of rejection. The second reason mature empaths become completely unbreakable is that they develop a level of psychological precision that cuts straight through human illusions. When you are a young empath, you tend to view the entire world through the lens of hope, optimism, and your own high moral standards. Because you possess a deeply caring heart, you naturally assume that everyone else operates with the same level of sincerity and kindness. You listen to people's words and believe them completely, blindly trusting beautiful promises, grand declarations of love, and charming apologies over and over again, even when their actual day-to-day actions tell a completely different story. You suffer through toxic cycles because you are constantly falling in love with a person's potential rather than looking at reality. This naive tendency to experience the world through raw emotional vulnerability rather than psychological defense makes young empaths the ultimate target for emotional parasites, manipulators, and wolves in sheep's clothing. But as the years roll by, life forces the empath to learn a very hard, unforgettable lesson. Human beings rarely display their true motives, hidden agendas, or darkest flaws on the surface. The legendary psychologist Carl Jung explained this beautifully through his concept of the shadow. Jung taught that every single individual carries an unconscious dark side, a psychological basement packed full of repressed insecurities, hidden envy, unexpressed malice, selfish ambitions, and fragile egos that they refuse to acknowledge to themselves, let alone show to the world. The fascinating thing about the human shadow is that the harder someone tries to suppress it and pretend they are completely perfect, the more that darkness unconsciously leaks out. It slips into reality through their passive-aggressive jokes, their subtle facial expressions, their sudden overreactions, and the tiny daily choices they think nobody else is smart enough to notice. While young empaths are easily blinded by a dazzling exterior, mature empaths are completely different. After being burned, betrayed, and blindsided one too many times by people who spoke beautifully but acted selfishly, older empaths entirely stop listening to people with just their ears. They start reading people through repeating behavioral patterns and the undeniable gaps between their spoken words and their real underlying motives. They begin to notice the terrifyingly common phenomenon of people who constantly preach about kindness and empathy, yet are only ever kind when there is a camera watching, an audience applauding, or a personal benefit to be gained. They see right through the individuals who use declarations of love as a sophisticated tool for control, and the people who put on a massive show of being humble while secretly feeding off a desperate, insatiable need to be admired and put on a pedestal. This hyper-awareness reveals itself most clearly in how a mature empath evaluates relationships. They begin to recognize a painful truth that shocks many young empaths. Some people are only happy when you are struggling. They notice the exact moment a close friend who seemed so deeply comforting, supportive, and present when you were down on your luck, suddenly grows cold, dismissive, distant, or subtly mocking the exact moment your life begins to improve. It is a devastating realization to look at someone you love and realize that their kindness was actually fueled by a sick need to feel superior to you. They only loved you when you were beneath them, because your struggle made them feel better about their own miserable life. The second you succeed, their hidden shadow leaks out as envy, masked behind passive-aggressive comments like, "You just got lucky." Once a mature empath sees this pattern play out a few times, they stop falling for the social script and start reading the raw human essence. This incredible ability is not some magical supernatural superpower or mystical intuition, even though it often feels that way to the people being exposed. It is simply the natural, hard-earned result of decades spent observing human nature under pressure. It is the psychological mastery that comes from watching the exact same manipulation tactics played out by different faces, in different cities, across different decades. Older empaths develop a mental database of human behavior. They pay attention to the tiny details that most people completely ignore. The way someone treats a waiter or a janitor when they think nobody important is watching. The subtle shift in a person's vocal tone, the exact moment they realize they aren't going to get what they want from you. Or that split-second flicker of pure hatred or jealousy in someone's eyes before they quickly paste a fake smile back onto their face. Because they understand the mechanics of the human shadow, mature empaths can see the real, unhealed wounds driving other people's toxic behavior long before those people even realize it themselves. When someone enters a room screaming, attacking, or projecting malicious energy, a mature empath doesn't get defensive or take it personally anymore. They see straight through the anger and recognize it as a desperate, pathetic attempt to cover up a deep-seated fear or an ancient inferiority complex. They understand that the person who is constantly gossiping, tearing others down, and criticizing everyone else is actually locked in a brutal, agonizing war with their own self-hatred. They recognize that the people who try the hardest to appear morally pure and perfect on the outside are often hiding the most chaotic, unaddressed darkness beneath the surface. This profound psychological precision makes older empaths incredibly unsettling and frightening to be around, even when there is absolutely no conflict. Human beings have an evolutionary instinct that tells them when their social mask is no longer working. We all desperately want the world to buy into the curated, perfect version of ourselves that we are performing. But standing in front of an experienced, mature empath feels like looking into a perfectly still, crystal clear lake. It is so quiet and unshakable that it effortlessly reflects back the exact flaws, insecurities, and ugly truths that you are trying hardest to hide from yourself. This is why manipulators will actively avoid a mature empath. They know their games won't work. The mature empath is no longer seduced by cheap charm, loud confidence, or magnetic charisma. They know that charisma and character are two completely different things. They have traded their naive illusions for absolute psychological clarity. And once you can see a person's true essence through their performance, it becomes physically impossible for them to deceive you twice. The third profound transformation that makes mature empaths completely unbreakable is that they lose every single ounce of their fear of being alone. When you are a young empath, your inner world is so deep, intense, and loud that prolonged silence can feel like an incredibly terrifying space to inhabit. Because of this, many young empaths spend their youth running away from themselves, completely terrified of the quiet. They develop a desperate need to surround themselves with constant, superficial noise just to stay distracted. They keep music playing late into the night. They leave the television on in the background. They engage in endless, meaningless text conversations, and they check their phones every 2 minutes, praying for a notification to pop up. They think they are just being social, but the brutal truth is that they are using the outside world as an emotional drug to numb a deep-seated anxiety. What they truly fear is not losing a specific person. What they actually fear is confronting the massive, echoing emptiness that appears the very second all the external noise stops. This exact fear is why so many young empaths trap themselves inside toxic friendships and stay for years inside dead, exhausting romantic relationships that have emotionally dried up long ago. They can see the red flags and they know they are miserable, but they choose to tolerate emotional abuse and disrespect simply because they are terrified of returning to the absolute silence of their own company. In ancient spiritual and mystical traditions, this forced confrontation with yourself is famously known as the dark night of the soul. The brilliant psychologist Carl Jung understood this process deeply from a scientific perspective. Jung knew that a human being can never truly access the deepest, most powerful layers of their own soul as long as they are continuously using the outside world to escape their own interior life. You cannot heal what you refuse to look at. This is exactly why life, in one way or another, almost always pushes an empathic person into a long, unavoidable period of profound isolation. Sometimes it happens through a devastating, earth-shattering breakup that leaves you completely abandoned. Sometimes it happens through a sudden, painful psychological awakening where you look around and realize that you no longer fit into the social circles, jobs, or environments that used to feel familiar. You look at your old friends and realize you have absolutely nothing in common with them anymore, leaving you stranded in a space where you feel entirely alien to the world around you. When this period of forced isolation begins, it initially feels like you have been thrown directly into the middle of a pitch-black ocean at night, with absolutely nothing to hold on to. Without the distraction of other people's drama, your own suppressed traumas, your unhealed wounds, and your deepest anxieties all rise to the surface at the exact same time. Carl Jung once wrote a legendary quote that perfectly captures this exact moment. "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." But the heavy price of this inner awakening is that you have to pass through a long, agonizing season where absolutely nothing stands between yourself and your raw thoughts anymore. Yet this painful crucible is exactly where the mature empath undergoes a beautiful, radical metamorphosis. After spending enough nights sitting entirely alone in an empty room, staring at the wall and dealing face to face with their own heaviest emotions, something shifts. They stop panicking. They breathe through the discomfort, and they slowly begin to realize that the inner stillness they spent their whole life running away from is not a terrifying abyss that will swallow them whole. It is actually a profound, unshakable sanctuary. This realization completely shatters their dependence on the outside world because they entirely stop treating external validation as a strict requirement for their personal peace of mind. They learn how to sit quietly with their own mind without needing a single distraction, and they develop a deep, fierce love for quiet, unbothered spaces. They begin to actively crave a morning where nobody disturbs them, a closed room filled with warm light and the sound of rain, a simple walk through nature, or a corner in a cafe where they can sit for hours just watching their own thoughts drift by. They do not do this because they hate humanity or because they have become bitter misanthropes. They do it because they have finally stopped relying on constant external stimulation to feel whole. They discover a majestic, quiet dignity in their own presence, realizing that their self-worth does not depend on how many phone calls they receive, how many invitations they get, or how many people they can satisfy on any given weekend. The moment an empath genuinely stops fearing solitude, they instantly become completely immune to almost every single form of emotional manipulation. This is the exact shift that completely terrifies narcissists, controllers, and toxic people. Manipulators thrive on exploiting an empath's fear of abandonment and rejection. They use the threat of leaving or the cold shoulder to force the empath into submission. But when you are no longer afraid of being alone, that threat completely loses its power over your life. Sudden silence from a toxic partner no longer triggers a panic attack. Instead, it just gives you a peaceful break from their drama. You no longer rush into rebound relationships just to fill an empty bed, and you no longer tolerate disrespect in friendship groups just to feel included. You confidently develop the strength to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served, because you know your empty house is waiting for you as a peaceful kingdom. Mature empaths ultimately discover a profound truth that changes how they navigate the rest of their lives. A clean, quiet, and peaceful loneliness is infinitely healthier than a loud, crowded life that slowly poisons and drains your soul.